You may have heard our special guest today, last night on Emily Rooney, Michael Patrick MacDonald. Michael is the author of the best-selling memoir, All Souls. He grew up in the Old Colony projects of South Boston, where 85% of the residents at that time collected welfare in an area with the highest concentration of impoverished whites in the United States. In Easter Rising, Michael's new memoir, he describes his forays outside of Southies Old Colony housing project, the role of punk music in changing his life, his alienation, his traumatic breakdown, and his 2 healing journeys to Ireland before becoming an anti-violence activist in Boston. Michael helped launch Boston's successful gun buyback program and founded the South Boston Vigil Group. He currently lives in Brooklyn and is a full-time writer. I'd like to thank our co-sponsor, NU Bookstore, thanks to the author, of course, and to library staff members, to Tim Meisel and Barnes & Noble, New York, Megan Wilson of Houghton Mifflin, for making today's event possible. And without further ado, Michael Patrick MacDonald.
Good afternoon. Thanks for coming out today. Oh, this is sudden. If you do much with that, that picks you up. Easter Rising was written in response to a lot of the questions I would receive, especially from educators across the country and guidance counselors, people who had read All Souls and wanted to know what is it that made you get out, what allowed you to escape, how do you continue to survive. And the reason educators are often asking that is around the whole resiliency conversation, and wanting to find kind of a formula that we can give to young people who are growing up in poverty and in isolated neighborhoods and insular places, or in any kind of a situation at home that might be chaotic or damaging in any way. And the question was once put that we need to find out what it was that you had that allowed you to break free of, not just physically get out of the neighborhood, but mentality-wise, to get beyond the neighborhood in a lot of ways, and to be able to live in a bigger world. And as if it was some kind of magic potion that you can bottle and then give to other young people growing up in similar situations. And I was always a little bit concerned by the question, because I feel like a lot of the conversation around resiliency really allows us to sidestep a lot of the social justice issues and instead focus on the idea that kids need to be tough and strong and suck it up and pull themselves up by their bootstraps and just get on with it. It is great to encourage, we need to encourage strength and resiliency as much as we can, but as adults it kind of gets us off the hook lots of times when we think that, if only these kids could just be stronger. It allows us to not have to make the world a better place, rather than focusing on what it is that makes, that'll make some kids survive. We need really to make a place, make the world a place where kids don't have to work so hard to survive. I think it's like if you took 100 kids and threw them into raging waters and 5 get out alive, and you say, let's, the whole resiliency studies thing, let's study, spend millions of dollars on those 5 kids, finding out how they got out, and rather than just not throwing kids into raging waters, which is what we do as a society, and as we're all involved in that as adults. And so I wrote this book in response to the question, but also to basically give not an answer. There is no answer to the question. It's really, how anyone survives all that trauma is an ongoing process, and it's something that they're going to have to engage in their entire lives, whatever level of trauma. Now, I have extreme examples of trauma in childhood, and for me, the most liberating day was when I realized that there's not going to come a time where I get to this plateau and it's all over and I'm healed. And that day, I was completely freed, because I was then allowed to just commit myself to a life of healing. And I've done it through activism, community organizing, taking all that painful experience that I'd grown up with, and in the activism, using it as, making it useful and in the world, and hopefully turning it into a gift. And I do it now with the writing. The writing is my form of activism. The writing is my form of taking all that painful stuff and kind of transforming it. So it's an ongoing process. In a few years it might be something else, but I've committed my life to that. As a, you know, there's a point in All Souls, I think, for anybody who read All Souls, you'll remember where when my brother was in trouble, there was a point where I could have either just, you know, taken my life after all the tragedies that had happened in my family, or I can live and find ways to make use of all that. And I chose the second. And so I feel like whether it's the activism or the writing, this is kind of my answer to this is what I do instead of all that numbing from alcohol, drugs, heroin, or suicide or violence in general. This is how I keep going, and it's partly by being able to talk about the things I've experienced, but also just feeling like I can use it as a gift. And I wouldn't have ever gotten to that point if I hadn't come to a place, you know, the end of this book is coming to a place where I really get my mother, where I really understand her, and where I really, after years of rejecting her and trying to get away from the family and everything that I come from, I come to a place where I'm able to actually embrace all the best qualities of home, whether it's South Boston, the community, or the strength I might get from the class background I come from, or my mother's example as someone who has experienced more trauma than I could ever imagine. It's one thing to lose siblings, but to lose a child, never mind four, is just unimaginable. And so to see, you know, the book gets to a place where I'm able to see my mother in a much different light, and to appreciate how she gets through this world, how she continues to get through this world. And in her own, if you know, anybody who knows her from All Souls, you know that in her own wacky way, what she's doing is transforming really painful experience and turning it into a gift for others. Whether it's with her accordion and the foot stomping tunes on the accordion, or playing guitar to crowds of people, or just taking someone who's recently lost a child or any loved one and just getting them up out of bed and pushing them out the door. People look at her and they say, you know, if this woman's still alive, and not only is she alive, she's like stomping her feet and playing the accordion, and they say, you know, it allows them to say, I think I'll be okay. And that's all you need. I mean, really, is to know that. So, and to know that, you know, it's a lifelong commitment. I think it's a false hope to lead kids to believe that there's this point where you get to and you're all better and you're out of the projects, or you're out of poverty, or you're able to, you know, you're completely healed in any way. It's a commitment. It's a lifelong commitment. And I think we all have to make that commitment. You know, we all suffer grief. We all suffer tragedy. That's life. And when we go through that, whether it's losing a mother, naturally of old age, or any other tragedy, we all have to learn that at some point, that people often say, I just wish I could go back to normal. You're not going to go back to normal. There is no normal. And we have to learn to find new normals. But the book begins when I'm first propelled out of the neighborhood, just physically. The first answer to the question, how did you get out of Southie, is literally just, the very first answer is at a very young age, I was really good at sneaking on trains. And that's just the physical mobility that I found, the access to the bigger world. And being good at it, and also having an interest in it, and interest in seeing, as I say in the book, strange places, strange people, and no, strange places and even stranger people. And that's kind of been, that's just, I don't know where that comes from, but I was always interested in seeing people beyond the people on my block. I wanted to see what's out there, see who's out there, and I've always been, I think it probably comes from my mother, because she's always been drawn to characters in a way. In the same way that I am, in the same way that in any of the books you'll see that, you know, I love characters. I love, you know, the people that make the world a more interesting place by being themselves. That includes my mother. But the real propulsion in the book begins when my brother Davey commits suicide by jumping off the roof in Old Colony Project. And this is something that I witnessed when I was 13, looking out the window. And the tragedy of that day, the pain of that day, is what makes me first have to get away from home, have to get away from my family. We all splintered at that point in different directions. I fortunately went over the Broadway Bridge and discovered the bigger world just over that small little Broadway Bridge, and at 13 in 1979 came upon the whole punk rock underground movement. And at the time, that world, I mean, there was such a distance between that world and everybody, but between that world and Southie, the difference was extreme. Because Southie was really, as much poverty and crime and violence there was, it was a very buttoned up place, and people were obsessed with like fitting in and being extremely normal, and there was a whole Southie look with the alligator shirt and the collar up and perfect hair and all that stuff. And that, the punk world I discovered rejected all of that, and it was all about being a freak and acknowledging that you are different and being proud to be different. And in a lot of these resiliency studies, that's one of the first things that they come across in studying kids for resiliency aspects. They all exhibit this ability to step outside of whatever chaos and dysfunction and to proudly declare their difference and to declare their autonomy. And that, for me, I mean, that can happen in school, that can happen with studies, but for me it happened through this discovery of this underground musical movement where everybody was encouraged to find their own autonomy and to decide who they might be and to imagine who they might become. I'm going to read a little bit from my first encounter with a record. And so this is really one of my first experiences with the music and what it meant to me. I just stolen it from a downtown record store. Back in Southie after dark, I took my usual route into the maze of Old Colony, through darkened courtyards, ducking under abandoned clotheslines from the time when people were trusting enough to hang their laundry outside, down the steps leading to the rear entrance of 8 Patterson, past the secretive voices of my sister Kathy and her friends getting high in the cellar, then a nimble jump over a huge polluted puddle, as kids we called it polio water, and into a dark hallway. If I could get past the polio water without stepping in it and didn't have to climb over any teenagers hanging out on the stairs or some mother's boyfriend camping out for the night, the rest of the coast was clear. But no matter what happened on this long route, it was better than having to make the ladies on the front stoop get up to let me pass. After Davy's death, I couldn't stand their sudden hush in my presence. Once in the apartment, I walked straight down the long hallway to my room at the back. I wanted to avoid anyone at home who might be awake, Ma or my older brothers and sisters. I knew they would think I was some kind of weirdo, carrying a record that said the Sex Pistols on the cover. In my room, I stared at the album's title, Never Mind the Bollocks. From being around the Irish all my life, I knew that bollocks meant balls, or was a name for someone you considered an idiot or an asshole, or else it meant just plain bullshit. I wondered which one the band meant. Kevin had given me a record player he'd swiped off the back of a truck, my brother Kevin. He couldn't sell it on the street because the plastic cover had broken off in the heist. Putting the needle on the record, I was distracted by a fight breaking out below my bedroom window. "You like fucking my man, don't you, Cookie?" Betty downstairs was yelling up to a neighbor across the street. "Because you want more babies. Because you're the mothering kind. Ain't that right, Cookie?" Everyone knew that for Betty's husband, Cookie was old news. These days he was messing around with Jeannie Gallagher, who was watching it all innocently from her window. But Betty had a baseball bat, and everyone was coming to see what she would do with it. "Because you want more money from the welfare, ain't that right, Cookie?" Then, in an instant of crashing guitar and a blood-curdling voice that I could barely understand, the world of Old Colony Project began to crumble around me, once and for all. It was terrifying and beautiful. Johnny Rotten's voice, whatever he was saying, chucked it all back out the window, every single thing I'd known my whole life. I understood what Never Mind the Bollocks meant. As the album progressed from Anarchy in the UK to Belson Was a Gas, ugly was beautiful and beautiful was ugly. All authority was mocked. The world around me was made weak and powerless by the most hideous and destructive voice I'd ever heard. In the collapse, a knot in my stomach, one I didn't even know I had, came undone. It was as if the voice was my own, and I'd rediscovered it in the rubble around me. The most important word I could make out upon the first listen was destroy. I'd often heard adults and commentators on TV saying how music like this could destroy kids' lives. Staring at the neon album covers kidnap letter style, for once I thought they might be right. But to me, that didn't feel like such a bad thing. The whole ethos of the time in that movement was really probably summed up in one of the first badges that I got. That was one of my first kind of statements, I guess, that I pinned to myself, which was in order to create, you must destroy. That was the whole ethos of a lot of that movement, which they inherited from the Dada movement earlier, and a lot of the artwork. And a lot of the artwork was about kind of reinvention, about tearing things up, destroying things that existed before. And so that became my goal. And it wasn't, I wasn't that conscious of it at the time. I wasn't really even conscious of it until I wrote this book. But I was really destroying everything that I'd come from, whether it was the neighborhood I came from, the class that I came from, the ethnicity I came from, all things Irish, wanted nothing to do with it, and included my family, my immediate family members, and with the further and further I get from home and from all that I come from, of course, the more alienated I become in the end. But in the initial stages, it was a very important break. It was an important break away from all that I was supposed to be by being from the Old Colony projects in South Boston. I was able to reimagine. I had the autonomy. That whole movement, I mean, people think of it now as like something where it's like a genre of music, like any genre of music. But at the time when it was an iconoclastic subculture, nobody looked the same in that movement. None of the bands sounded alike. It really encouraged individualism. And that's what I loved about it. That's what I was drawn to, and that's what I needed in order to break away from what at the time felt like a cult. I mean, South Boston in the 70s really felt like a cult. And so this was kind of, in a way, this is my deprogramming period. A lot of times people also associate that, any kind of musical subcultures with drugs and people getting messed up. And that would happen, of course, but for me, I was able to stay sober and never do drugs during that whole period because there was really no peer pressure. If I could be around people that were even using heroin, and I had no desire and no pressure to do that at all. Part of what was happening was that you're rejecting normal. The worst thing you could be in that world was normal. And so the worst thing you could say about someone was, he's normal, or she's normal. And you wanted nothing to do with that person. But for me, normal, where I came from, normal meant using coke, freebasing coke, and racism. I mean, those were norms. Those are the biggest norms that I was rejecting. To me, drugs were what normal and not very creative people did. And so I stayed clean and sober through the whole period. And a lot of people did in this movement. You were allowed to do that. If you said I don't do drugs, people were like, well, that's interesting. Like anything. I mean, it was just another way to be an individual. And so it was allowed. I'm going to read a piece that's kind of where I'm interacting with the culture that I come from, and on one of my many escapes out of the neighborhood to go see a band. And this happens on St. Patrick's Day during the parade when I'm 14. It's my 14th birthday. The St. Patty's Day parade had come and gone, and the mobs on Southies streets had funneled into the local barrooms. An eerie calm settled over the trash-strewn parade route. The muted sound of happy-go-lucky songs would blare only occasionally outside a tavern when brawlers erupted through the doors onto Dorchester Street. Having avoided the parade, I figured it was safe to leave the house again, until I realized Ma was playing the accordion for a few neighbors on the front stoop and drawing a crowd. She called up to the window telling me to come down so she could play Happy Birthday for me. But I wanted nothing to do with St. Patrick's Day or my 14th birthday. The Clash was in town, and that was all I cared about. Seamus and Stevie were disappointed that I didn't stop to eat the pound cake they'd stuck a bunch of candles in for my birthday. I'd waited all day for the streets to die down and was afraid I'd be late for the show. I avoided Ma and the party on the stoop by taking the stairs to the roof, crossing rooftops, and exiting from a building on the outskirts of the project. The way to the train station was littered with torn green garlands, broken beer bottles, and the occasional puke. In 2 places I stepped over blood. I thought back to the time when I looked forward to the fights on St. Patty's as much as the parade itself, when the stories and the blow-by-blow descriptions of fights with outsiders kept us all in stitches for days. A few stragglers on Dorchester Street held onto a wall to feel their way to the next pub, never far away in Southie. They were all decked out in green and regained their composure just long enough to focus on my black clothes and say, "What the fuck?" or "Where's the funeral?" One was sitting on the curb draped in green Hawaiian lace and wearing a huge button that said, "God made the Irish #1. He looked abandoned, like he was the only one who hadn't been told the parade was over and that everyone had gone to the bars. He looked up at me and said, What, you're not Irish or something? A gang of small kids playing in their front yard ran toward me, shouting in unison, bum, bum, bum. They'd been doing it every time I passed them on my way to and from the train station. Each kid leapt onto the chain-link fence and chanted louder and louder before quieting down to let one brave one ask me, "How come you look like a bum?" The question was always earnest. I got a kick out of the little gang, so I just laughed and gave them a different story each time. One day I was a chimney sweep. Another day I was wearing a dark suit. I was an undertaker. But this time I was in too much of a hurry to stop and talk. I left them behind, their faces pressed up against the fence. The brave one, in a last-ditch effort, screamed once more, "Bum!" I was going to walk to Broadway Station a half-mile on because the transit police had been cracking down on the secret entrance at Andrew Station. When I got to Andrew, though, it seemed like a ghost town. Because of the parade, no cops were in sight. I lay on my back to crawl under the gap in the security fence. A couple of years before, I discovered that the fence at the station entrance could be lifted just enough to slide under it. It required a group effort. Usually one or even better, two of my friends from Old Colony would hold the fence up with all their might, while one by one the rest slid underneath on our backs, then helped the others through the passage. Then we were off for joyrides to Quincy, our backs usually black with dirt and gravel, until I started carrying a scrap of cardboard to put under us in the slide. Without the older teenagers, we never dared get off the train in other people's neighborhoods, unless it was Quincy, where all the ex-Southie people lived, when they betrayed the neighborhood by moving out. Kevin said they all thought they were high and mighty when they made it to Quincy, so he and the other Southie kids didn't mind stealing bikes there. But for me, it was enough just to get my friends to walk around in Quincy, where we wouldn't get jumped by blacks like in Dorchester, or be given dirty looks by the rich liberals in Cambridge. I didn't need cardboard to slide on these days, since I wore clothes that looked better dirty or torn. I undid a bondage strap from my pants when it got caught on a chain link, and slid under the fence. When I got through to the other side, I heard a fight break out downstairs at the tracks. I peeked down and saw my old friends from Old Colony being kicked off the train. They yelled nigger at the conductor as he pulled out of the station. I didn't want them to see me, so I waited at the top of the steps, hidden from view, until they got on the next train. I was already late, and was going to be later if I had to skip this train, so I raced down the steps and caught it two cars down from them. I knew they'd be getting off at the next Southie stop, Broadway, while I'd ride on to Park Street to see a band all the way from England. To my friends, I might just as well be crossing the Atlantic Ocean. The further and further I got from my family in the neighborhood, the more I engaged in the kind of attitudes that people outside of Southie would have towards Southie, and would never tell people I was from there. In that world, in the cosmopolitan world I was living in, where people are artists and musicians and so forth, I would engage in the kind of conversations about Southie just as blanket labeling the place backwards, white trash, and ignorant. I would never tell people I was from there, and only eventually I would come around to telling some very close friends. It would take me a while to do that I was from there. And a lot of this book is a lot of push and pull back and forth, and the first escape is the one I was just reading from in that period after my brother's suicide. And the first time I'm pulled back is when my sister, only a year and a half after Davy went off the roof, she also went off the roof in a struggle over pills, and she was in the coma for 5 months, so I was, pulled back home tenuously in that period. When she came out of the coma, it was kind of like a new lease on life for me. It actually happened on Easter Sunday. There are a few references to Easter in here, but that's the first kind of Easter rising, and that's with her coming out of the coma, I escaped from the neighborhood further this time to New York's Lower East Side, and spent a lot of time hanging out with, sleeping on people's couches all over the Lower East Side in New York, which was really like the mecca for that whole punk and art world at the time. So in 1981, 82, 83, I was hanging out a lot in New York's Lower East Side, and I was 15, 16, 17. And then the second time I'm pulled home is when my brother Frankie and my brother Kevin died 8 months apart from each other. Frankie died involved in an armored car heist, and then Kevin died 8 months after him, found hanging in prison. And those two tragedies, those violent deaths from their involvement in the streets in Southie back home, brought me back to Southie and made me want to stay there and never leave, because I was so guilty for ever having left. Because I hadn't been around my brothers in their last days, and had been out to the bigger world and was hanging out with people in the East Village and living my life, I was extremely guilty for ever having left in the first place. So at that point, I came home and really wanted to stay home. I was dressing Southie, and this was like, 84, and wanted to be just like everybody else, and I wanted to be closer to the neighborhood, to be closer to my brothers actually, and I thought the best way to do that would be to learn to embrace this place that they lived for, that they loved, that they lived for, and that they ultimately died for. And it didn't work, and because I was alienated in Southie. I'd been to the bigger world. A lot of people hadn't been beyond just the few blocks that we lived in the housing projects, and it wasn't working for me at all in terms of the conversations that would go on, or my references to things in the bigger world that people wouldn't get. And that's when I realized that the real insularity of the place. And the way I put it in the book, the best way to describe it is that at the time, this is 84, I describe it that I'd been to the bigger world, because I was hanging out in the East Village, I'd been to the bigger world. I knew about things like Keith Haring and Brie. And in Southie, those are two references that would, you'd be called communist if you're looking for Brie or something at that time. And those are two things that are, of course, very, mainline these days, and so mainstream, both of them, they're pop cultural 80s things, but at the time, they were like huge cultural leaps for me to discover, just the kind of food you discover and exposure to art and so forth. And so I ventured out again. Well, I would go to I would be home and alienated in this period after my brother's death. So this is like really the most extreme post-traumatic stress period of the book. And then I would be alienated. I'd go back out to the Rathskeller and to the clubs in Boston, and be alienated there because of course nobody had experienced what I had experienced, which is I just lost my third and fourth siblings, and violently, and so I couldn't relate to anyone in the punk scene at all. Because people weren't coming from the kind of place I was coming from. And so I ventured further, this time beyond New York, and this time to Europe. I saved money washing dishes. This whole book is kind of like just a forward propulsion. And this time it was to Europe, and I was going to every single country in Western Europe. Also good at sneaking on trains, because I went with $400 for 6 weeks. I did run out of the money and have to call home and to borrow some more. And my mother, of course, didn't have money, so I called her father. My grandparents were all from Ireland, and I was very close to my mother's parents, who were from there. And so I called my grandfather, and he said he would lend me $200, which was huge at the time. I had about 2 weeks left for this trip. And he said he'd send me the $200, but only if I went to Ireland. And that made me sick to my stomach. I wanted nothing to do with Ireland. I didn't want to go anywhere near the place. I thought of it as one big Southie that. And I was rejecting all of that, as I said before. So I promised him I'd go there, and decided I'd probably go for only 2 days and get the heck out. So he sent me the money. I went there, and it completely changed my life. It was the beginning of me finding a context for understanding everything that I come from, for understanding the neighborhood I came from, for understanding my family, my mother, myself. Just the rest of the book is really about this continued propulsion forward, but kind of a return to home, a reconnecting, so to speak, and a return to a sense of home. It's not about returning to, or having to spend the rest of my life in Southie, or returning to Old Colony Project, which All Souls was often mistaken for, just the physical return. But it's really, I can live anywhere, and I'm still going to be on this journey, getting closer to home. And so, but I would never have been able to have begun that journey back home and to embracing everything that I come from if I first hadn't gone to Ireland and found in Ireland, in the culture of Ireland, the history of Ireland, and the politics of Ireland, especially being very much exposed to the politics, the current history that lives in the north of Ireland. I would never have been able to establish the kind of politics I have and the world perspective I have around class, around race, and so forth, if I hadn't gone there and been able to make use of my family situations in the way that I've tried to do it as an organizer and activist. So the trip to Ireland really changed everything. And that's another thing with resiliency studies, is that is this whole idea of finding a context for whatever oppression someone has experienced, whatever trauma someone's experienced, being able to find a context to put it in. The most obvious example of that is if you grew up African American in this country, you have to have the context of racism. I mean, without that context, without that understanding that we live in a racist society, you're going to feel a little bit crazy. I mean, it's for me, the context was really a class, and it helped me and colonization, the history of colonization, and the impact that might have had on the people that I come from. But within that, the whole class paradigm as well. So the final thing I'm going to read is at a turning point on this trip to Ireland, where I was in this country and I'm like, get me the heck out of here, I can't wait to get home, and want nothing to do with this place. But I was slowly starting to see my family everywhere. I was seeing my grandmother's head on every little kid walking by, and seeing my grandmother's head on the lady selling vegetables, and the woman buying vegetables, and the guy driving by in a tractor, he had my grandmother's head. And so that's the first familiarity that happens, and then I'm slowly realizing that we really come from this place in terms of the conversation. Another thing that happened that blew my mind, that started to change everything, was the first question I received from everybody up there is it true you're all racist? And that was what they wanted to know. And this was in 1984, where people were deeply ashamed of what they had heard about, the Irish American racism that they had heard about. Because up there in the north of Ireland, for people who don't know, it's always portrayed as a religious thing between Catholics and Protestants, but it's not. The Catholics are the descendants of the native people, and the Protestants are descendants of the Anglo-ascendancy. They're the colonizers. So it's a colonizer and colonist, and the Protestant class has privilege and the Catholic class doesn't. So it's basically, the way people put it up there is that it's basically like it's been an apartheid situation up there in the north. And Catholics would be black, and Protestants would be white. I'm going to read from the part where things start to turn around, and I start to see how much we really do come from this place. It was a 2-mile walk to the nearest phone. None of my relatives have phones, and this was '84. Now Ireland is this, I know it's this totally modern place with the new economy in the past few years, but this was the mid-'80s when no one I was related to had a phone. It was a 2-mile walk to the nearest phone, Rose said, but I needed to call home. It was the 6th anniversary of my brother Davy's death. Being in Ireland had made me think of him often, since he'd spent a few months here before he got sick. After Davy ran away from home and started to get into trouble, Ma thought Ireland would be good for him. She had sent him to stay with her cousin Dan Murphy down in Kerry. After being in this country for just a few days, I couldn't imagine that it hadn't been good for him. I couldn't see anything bad happening here. Then I remembered Ma once saying that Davy had run away from Dan Murphy's, gone to Northern Ireland, and been arrested by the police. I had felt the tension in the air in the north, and after hearing Mary's stories, this girl I met there, I wanted to find out more about Davy's experience. I couldn't wait to call home, and now I had an excuse other than my usual anxiety. In this period I was going through, I was always calling home, seeing if anybody else was dead. All day I'd resisted the urge to call, though, and it was a good thing because I'd felt it at first at about noon, 6 in the morning at home. Ma would have been pissed off if I'd called her that early to ask if everyone was still alive. It had been a few months since my last worried call home. Now it was almost 11 at night in Ireland, and I couldn't sleep. I knew I'd be up all night unless I called. The 2-mile walk down a winding country road with tall hedges and no sidewalk was blacker than any that Grandpa had ever described in his stories. I wasn't sure I'd see a phone booth unless I tripped over it. On the edge of a field, I finally saw the silhouette of a rectangular shape blacker than the night around it. No one at home would ever believe me when I told them that the phone had no rotary dial. I didn't know what to do with it at first, but then I remembered from a Beverly Hillbillies episode I'd seen as a kid that each number was given by the number of clicks of the lever. But I didn't know how to indicate 0 to get the operator, so I just kept clicking continuously. Sure enough, a woman's voice came through, sounding groggy, like I'd woken her. She sounded like just any woman in the kitchen. And when I apologized for waking her, she explained that she was the operator and asked would I like to make a call. I gave her Ma's number so she could do the dialing and asked Ma if she'd accept the charges. "Oh, sure, operator, is he there?" Ma yelled, "Mike!" When I said hello, Ma and the operator kept talking like they couldn't hear me. "Well, he was here a minute ago, so he was," the operator said. "Hello," I yelled, but they carried on without me. "Where are you from?" Ma asked the operator. "Carndona," she said. "Hello," I screamed again, hoping they might hear even a trace of my voice. I looked around at the blackness beyond the now lighted booth, thinking about the walk home after a useless attempt at calling Ma. "For God's sake, that's where my mother's from," Ma shouted, excited, like she and the operator were long-lost cousins. Even in Boston, Ma always acted like it was an amazing coincidence to meet someone from Ireland, and now she was talking to someone from a small town filled with her mother's people. "Hello," I shouted, not wanting to give up so soon. I started clicking the lever over and over, since I had no idea what it had done in the first place to get the operator. The operator asked Ma what was her mother's name, and her mother's mother's name, and whether her mother's mother married this O'Donnell or that O'Donnell. And Ma kept up with her, and before long the two of them figured out that they were third or fourth or fifth cousins, depending on how you count generations. The Irish operator introduced the whole new concept of once removed, which threw Ma off. But before long, Ma was referring to her and the operator as just cousins. "Can you hear me?" I screamed into the mouth of the phone, cupping it with both hands. "Hello?" The conversation went on for 40 minutes, and with Ma getting into whether this person or that person Ma getting into whether this or that person she'd met when she was 18 had ended up in a good marriage or a bad marriage, or had stayed a bachelor, or run off with another woman to Australia or America, an Irish divorce as she called it. Ma and the operator got on like a house on fire, and the conversation could have carried on all night until Ma turned the questions to the operator's love life, and whether she was in a good marriage or a bad marriage or no marriage at all. That's when the operator quickly started wondering, where's the boy gone to? "Well, did he sound all right?" Ma said. "He sounded grand," said the operator. "So he did," she added. "Well, that's all that matters, isn't it?" Ma said. "Aye, surely," the operator agreed. "How's he looking?" Ma asked. I thought that one was ridiculous, but was floored when the operator actually had a report to give, saying she hadn't seen me herself, but that she'd heard from her sister's husband, who crossed paths with me on the Cundana Road 2 days earlier, that I was in good form. Ma always said you can't take a shit in Ireland without everyone knowing, and now I knew what she meant. The two cousins said their farewells, and Ma told her to say hello to this cousin and that cousin. "Mother of God, wasn't it strange to meet in this way, to get a call like this out of the blue," Ma said, as if I had nothing to do with it. "Hello," I attempted one last time before they hung up. "Operator," Ma screamed, and I thought she'd heard my shouts. "What is it?" the operator said, a bit startled by Ma's urgent tone. "You're not going to charge me for this, are you?" "Ach, no," she laughed, and the two of them hung up. On the walk back through the blackness, I couldn't get over that my family had come from this strange but familiar place. There wasn't even a passing car to light the road occasionally. There was complete silence and the peaceful echoes of crickets and fields that were too black even to look at, for fear of what else was in there besides crickets, what ghosts. And that's the beginning of things turning around for me, and as I'm exiting Ireland, I pass through the streets of Derry. Donegal is just right over the border, and Derry is very close. And passing through the streets of Derry, I see even more in this urban environment, just how much, how similar it was to the place I came from. I saw so many people that looked like my neighbors, and the same kind of toughness, the same humor, the same kind of struggle that you could see, except in Derry the difference was that it seemed like people knew where they stood in the bigger scheme of things, and that was something. That's when I first started to realize that in this country we don't really, where working class people tend to vote conservative and so forth. It just blew my mind to meet working class people and poor people who certainly didn't vote for Margaret Thatcher in England, but would not vote conservative, and couldn't believe that Ronald Reagan was the president that people in my neighborhood had voted for, especially in Derry, because they were engaged in this struggle against Margaret Thatcher in the years of the hunger strikes, and of course her best friend was Ronald Reagan in those years, and people in my neighborhood, while supporting the hunger strikes and supporting the struggle of Catholics in the North, were voting for Ronald Reagan, and that contradiction had always kind of blown me away. So returning from Ireland, that trip was the beginning of my studying the history and the literature and the culture, the politics of the North, and the rest of my life, it being kind of a context from which to continue on this journey of healing. Like I said, it's an ongoing process, and it's a journey closer and closer to home, or a sense of home, without necessarily having to return to a certain place. I can take that with me anywhere. And toward the end of the book, again, the final trip to Ireland is with my mother in '98. And for anyone who can, I encourage anyone to take a trip with a parent, wherever that might be, because for me, it was in my 30s, and it was like the first time we were hanging out adult to adult. I mean, through the process of the trip, I'm starting to just see her as another person. And that's a major transformation that also can happen between us and our parents, or us and our kids. So I'm going to end there and take any questions people might have, but thank you.
I don't really have a question, but I do have a comment. I read the book today, and what you were speaking about today in that process of letting go and letting go, I thought you documented beautifully that by the time you took off for Europe, you really had become like an empty vessel, and that once you got to Ireland, I watched as you sort of filled that vessel back up again.
Wow.
And I held my breath at the end of the book when it came to your father's funeral, because I thought that you were going to crash again, and I was sort of praying that you weren't. And it was sort of proof to me, after the misunderstanding at the wake, when you were okay, what had happened, that you had gone through a major kind of healing in your life, and that you would be able to go on and face just about anything that happened. And I loved the way you ended it.
Thank you.
That vision
Thanks
with
a lot.
you and your mother saying, we really didn't know what was going to happen after this, but that was okay.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Very nicely done.
Thank you. I like that interpretation a lot. I received a letter from someone who is a poet in Vermont, and I really loved her interpretation, which is similar to yours. She thought, and she's in her 70s, and you know, sometimes I'm worried about people getting through the punk rock references and all the kind of, you know, nihilism and or even just references to Patti Smith and all that kind of stuff. Or, you know, the main thing is that it's, you know, all you need to know is that a band is called the Stranglers and another band is called the Damned, and that's, I kept it at that. So those references are more for the color that, you know, and for an idea of what that movement was about, which was kind of, for me at the time, a necessary nihilism, you know, that I had to go through. But this interpretation from this woman in her 70s, I mean, she loved all those aspects. I was so glad to hear that, you know, someone in her 70s was able to, you know, embrace the whole punk rock aspect of the book, you know. And her interpretation was that that all of the, you know, the destructo lyrics and anarchism and black clothes and the darkness of, and then later the sickness, the hypochondria and the kind of obsession, even in the post-punk period with my own death. She said that she felt like I was creating this dark place that could be filled with light. So that's the same interpret. So they could be filled with life or light, however you look at that. So it's similar to how you interpret it. And thanks for that.
I have read both your books, and I found them quite moving. And I have really two questions. First is about religion. Both of your books have references in the title, and sprinkled with reference to religion, but you think your faith, you've said, is a little bit weak, and I'm wondering how you decided to name your books with religious allusions. The second, both books don't have too much mention of sexual behavior, and I'm wondering how you decided to not talk about that.
Yeah. In this book, the thing about that is that that's something that you should see in the subtext. That's me being distant, you know, a really detached teenager, and that's more in this book, the detachedness, because I meet this girl from Derry and we're going out with each other, and then when I leave Derry, I'd never say goodbye to her, and that's something that's, you know, that's a post-traumatic stress symptom as well. That is kind of an ongoing issue, you know, that I've had to deal with a lot. But
so the lack of connection is part of that? Yeah,
it's like when people go through a lot of death, I mean, basically when I, you know, even 2 years ago when I was going up with this girl, the problem was that I'm imagining death. Anybody that gets too close to you just dies. That's my experience in life. And so I wanted that to come through also with the detachment that happens with this girl, Mary, in Derry, in the county of Derry, you know. And the first thing about it, the religious thing, my faith is actually very strong. In the book, I try to express that I lacked faith, of course, when your sister's in a coma and you're like, you know, angry at God, or my brother Frankie died in the bank robbery and really, really angry at God. And there's a lot of push and pull with faith. And they ultimately being called what they're called, All Souls and Easter Rising, I think tells you that my faith is a kind of liberation theology faith, you know, and I just work with the images and symbols of the Catholicism that I come from and try to make them more relevant to the streets. So that for me, I mean, last night I did a reading with Kip Tiernan, who's the founder of Rosie's Place, and she's the head of the Poor People's United Fund, and she's an 80-year-old woman, tough cookie, been, you know, fighting the good fight for years, and the way she interprets the gospel really, I mean, last night she was reading from her new book, Urban Meditations. If you can get it, please do. But her interpretation of the gospel is really, for me, what I would, I mean, it's like I want to join that church. Unfortunately, there really isn't one. But, you know, in her church, like she said last night, her church is in the streets. Her church is the struggle, and that's where it ought to be. And I think that, you know, every religion has its liberation theology branches to it, and that's something that I'm interested in. So with either of these, like some people thought this is a really Christian title. It's a reference to the Easter Uprising, of course, but I, you know, I want that also to interpret a kind of ascent, and also my reclaiming of that imagery, that whether people believe in the resurrection or not, we all, you know, it's a universal concept of death and rebirth, and that's something that happens throughout this entire book, is death and rebirth. And I wanted to be clear that that's an ongoing thing in my life. So it's not like some neatly tied up healing process that I went through and I got to a place where I can move on and I'm healed. It's an ongoing thing.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah.
Well, I kind of had two questions, but I just wanted to know, while you were doing the activism and Georgia and Rockford, Madison, how did you deal with other people's families' death and connecting with them and not going back to your own family's death and dwelling on that? And how do you feel that that main legal issue back, the gun buyback, and how do you feel that you started that, and here again, how many years later, he's still doing this and he's still working in the community?
Thanks. Well, the first thing, when I first started doing community organizing work, I didn't know why I was doing it. I just was pulled to deal, you know, in retrospect, I can say I was pulled to deal with these issues that had impacted my life so much. And it was kind of me feeling around for that. You know, I hadn't really discovered yet how much it would mean to me and how much it would be part of this healing thing. And so in that process, I would be drawn to all these people who had also lost siblings or children and who were murdered in the streets. And they were mostly from Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, and because that's where we were doing that kind of work. Because in Southie and Charlestown at the time, there was still this level of denial and a code of silence where you weren't allowed to really talk about this stuff. In my own neighborhood, I would never have felt comfortable at that point talking about this stuff. So I had to go to Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, and met some of the best friends in my life who were mostly mothers of murdered children, who were just, you know, powerful people who had taken back the streets and just wishing that stuff could happen back home. But eventually I'm able to take that back home only because the Charlestown mothers were the first people who were, you know, it was an Irish-American community. These people that looked so much like the people I grew up with were standing up. They were standing up to gangsters. They were standing up to the criminal justice system, to the police, and they would take no prisoners. You know, these women were like not taking no for an answer. I mean, if anybody saw the movie Monument Ave, it doesn't really. The most important thing about the Charlestown story is this movement of women, of mothers that really broke the code of silence in that neighborhood, and they were an inspiration to me to bring the stuff I was doing. Once I went to Charlestown, I was able to go back home to Southie and to work on these issues back home. They gave me the courage to do that. So the inspiration really came from other people, other survivors, like seeing also the power of what happens when they tell their story and how it transforms them. When you tell your story of whatever tragedies or violence, whatever, you might be encouraging kids to turn in their guns or whatever, but the most important thing that's happening is that the person telling the story is completely transformed by it. And I started to see that, and that's when I started going deeper into the writing, you know, and that's when I discovered my own storytelling as something to engage in for this healing process. And I was totally supporting the gun buyback program recently, and behind the scenes, and was really supportive of that effort. And it was turned out it was really, really successful by the level of guns. And when people criticize programs like that, they often want to say, well, you know, someone got shot last week and someone, you know, people are still dying. But the main power of the gun buyback program in the 90s was that it was the beginning of a movement in Boston. It brought people together, and it's that grassroots movement that really changed the culture of violence on the streets. It ended, there were no murders among juveniles for 2 years in the late 90s, and we could get back to that in Boston, but the movement fell apart after the Boston success. It fell apart because people, you know, well, what happened was, I believe that it fell apart when Clinton came to town to celebrate Boston's success rates, and he pretty much gave all the credit to the police department, when it was really a grassroots effort that reduced violence in Boston streets. And so a lot of the community folks that were involved in turning the streets around said, well, you won't be needing me anymore. If the police are doing this, then what do you need me for? You can't change, you can't bring change without it being from the bottom up, from the grassroots. If people aren't invested in the safety on their own streets and their own neighborhoods, then it's not going to change. Thanks.